In 1936, King Edward VIII gave up the throne of the British Empire to marry an American divorcee. In 2018, Prince Harry married an American divorcee, and absolutely nothing happened. Same institution, same church, same family, 82 years apart. So what changed? The official answer involves evolving church doctrine, shifting public attitudes, and the modernization of a 1,000-year-old institution. And sure, that's part of it. But here's the thing. The rules didn't actually change as much as you'd think. What changed was how desperately the monarchy needed good publicity by 2018. And when you need good publicity badly enough, you find ways to forget the standards that dethroned a king. Let me walk you through how we got here. Because it involves 2 divorces, 1 Nazi meeting, a German kidnapping plot involving an SS general, at least 3 convenient hunting accidents, and 1 very stubborn queen who watched her entire worldview crumble over 70 years. But first, a pattern you should know about. Because throughout British royal history, when someone stood between a brother and the throne, that someone had a remarkable tendency to stop standing anywhere at all. We'll get to that. First, let's talk about Wallis Simpson. Not the romantic version, the real one. The woman Edward VIII loved wasn't just divorced, she was divorced twice. Her first husband was Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a United States Navy aviator she married on November 8, 1916, in Baltimore. The marriage was a disaster. Spencer was an alcoholic who allegedly locked her in the bathroom during his drunken rages. Wallis later described these incidents in detail. Not exactly the foundation for a fairy tale. She finally obtained her divorce in December 1927, after establishing residency in Warrenton, Virginia, specifically to satisfy jurisdictional requirements. But here's where it gets interesting. Before that divorce was even finalized, she'd already started seeing someone else. Ernest Aldrich Simpson was a British-American shipping executive who was himself divorcing his first wife, Dorothea. Wallis and Ernest married on July 21, 1928, in London. So by the time she entered the Prince of Wales' social circle in 1931, Wallis Simpson was a woman with 2 living former husbands. 2. In 1930s Britain, that wasn't just scandalous. It placed her outside respectable society entirely. Now, you might think a king could do whatever he wanted. He's the king, right? Wrong. The monarch of Britain isn't just the head of state. He's also the supreme governor of the Church of England, a position established when Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1534, specifically so he could get his own divorce, which is ironic if you think about it for more than 3 seconds. In 1936, the Church of England's position was unambiguous. Divorced persons could not remarry in church while their former spouse remained alive. Period. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, was absolutely opposed to any arrangement that would allow Edward to marry Mrs. Simpson and remain king. After the abdication, Lang delivered a radio address that didn't mince words. He criticized Edward's craving for private happiness and condemned the social circle of individuals whose standards and ways of life are alien to all the best instincts and traditions of his people. Imagine a religious leader going on national radio to call the former king's friends morally deficient. That happened. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin gave Edward 3 options. First, give up Wallis entirely and remain king. Second, marry her against ministerial advice, which would trigger the immediate resignation of the government, creating a constitutional crisis that would require Edward to find alternative ministers willing to support him. He couldn't find any. Third, abdicate. There was technically a 4th option, a morganatic marriage where Wallis would become Edward's legal wife, but would not receive the title of queen, and any children would be excluded from succession. This would require parliamentary legislation not just in Britain, but in every dominion. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State. Baldwin canvassed every one of them in late November 1936. Every single dominion rejected the proposal. On December 10, 1936, Edward formally abdicated. The following evening, December 11th, he sat before a microphone at Windsor Castle and delivered a radio address to approximately 400 million subjects across the British Empire. After precisely 326 days on the throne, he spoke the words that would define his legacy. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." And with that, he became the first English monarch in history to voluntarily surrender the crown. Within hours, he departed for France. Beautiful story, right? The king who gave up everything for love? Well, about that. Here's where the narrative gets complicated, because there's something the romantic version leaves out, something the British establishment knew, and the public didn't learn until documents emerged after World War II. Edward was a Nazi sympathizer. Less than a year after his abdication, on October 11, 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor arrived in Nazi Germany for a 12-day official visit. The ostensible purpose was to study German housing and labor conditions. The actual itinerary included extensive meetings with senior Nazi officials and multiple photographs that appeared to show Edward giving what looked very much like a Nazi salute. His defenders called it a standard wave. You can look at the photographs yourself and decide. The visit culminated on October 22, 1937. That's when Edward and Wallace traveled to Berchtesgaden for a personal meeting with Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat. Photographs from this meeting show the Duchess shaking hands with the Führer. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, recorded in his diary that the Duke appeared very friendly and sympathetic to German perspectives. It gets worse. Much worse. When France fell in June 1940, the Duke and Duchess fled to neutral Spain, then Portugal, as German forces advanced. While they were in Lisbon waiting for transport, German intelligence developed something called Operation Willy. This wasn't casual diplomacy. This was an active kidnapping and manipulation plot conceived in the summer of 1940. Directed by SS Brigadeführer Walter Schellenberg, one of the most cunning intelligence officers in the Nazi apparatus. Schellenberg was personally dispatched to Portugal to oversee the operation. The plan was audacious. German agents were to either persuade the Duke to remain in Europe voluntarily, or, failing that, to abduct him and the Duchess across the Spanish border. The Germans seeded disinformation suggesting the British Secret Service intended to assassinate the Duke. They spread rumors through intermediaries that the Duke's life was in danger if he returned to British territory. They dangled the prospect of returning him to the throne after a German victory, a puppet king for a conquered Britain. The German planners weren't subtle about their ambitions. Captured documents reveal they believed the Duke could serve as an alternative head of state following the expected invasion. They'd even prepared a role for him in the new order. Documents seized from German archives after the war, collectively known as the Windsor File, included diplomatic telegrams that made British intelligence's blood run cold. One telegram from the German ambassador in Lisbon reported that the Duke had allegedly suggested that continued bombing of Britain might persuade the British public to accept a negotiated peace. Think about that. The former King of England allegedly telling Nazi diplomats that bombing his own former subjects could be strategically useful. Edward denied these characterizations for the rest of his life. Historians continue to debate whether the German diplomatic reports reflected what was actually said or what German officials hoped to hear. But here's what we know for certain. Prime Minister Winston Churchill took the security risk seriously enough to essentially exile the Duke to the Bahamas, where he'd been conveniently appointed governor. Maximum distance between the former king and the European theater. The Duke departed Lisbon on August 1st, 1940, and spent the entire war thousands of miles from any position where he could cause damage. This reframes everything about the abdication, doesn't it? The British establishment publicly cited the divorce issue as the insurmountable obstacle. And it was a genuine problem. The Church of England position was real. But senior figures in government had other reasons to want Edward gone. His political judgment was unreliable. His sympathies toward Nazi Germany were known within inner circles. His determination to marry an American woman with 2 ex-husbands offered a convenient and publicly acceptable justification for his removal. The Church of England provided the mechanism. The underlying motivations were more complex. Which brings us to that pattern I mentioned. Because when the British monarchy needs someone removed from the succession, they have options. Abdication is the polite one, the newer one. Throughout most of royal history, the preferred method was simpler: hunting accidents. Let's talk about William Rufus. On August 2, 1100, King William II of England, known as William Rufus for his ruddy complexion, rode into the New Forest for a day of deer hunting. He was the son of William the Conqueror. He'd ruled England for 13 years. He was not universally loved. The chronicles describe him as vain, possibly homosexual, certainly irreligious, and deeply unpopular with the church. But he was king. Until that afternoon. What happened next depends on who you believe. The official account says an arrow, fired by a French nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, struck the king in the chest while aimed at a deer. A tragic accident. These things happen when you're shooting projectiles at high speed in dense woodland. Walter Tyrrell fled immediately. Not walked, not stayed to mourn. Fled. He rode straight for the coast and crossed to France before anyone could question him about what had happened. Meanwhile, the king's younger brother, Henry, was hunting in the same forest. The same forest. On the same day. What remarkable coincidence. When he learned of his brother's death, Henry didn't pause to grieve. He didn't wait for a formal process. He rode directly to Winchester, secured the royal treasury, and within 3 days had himself crowned King of England. 3 days. Their elder brother Robert, Duke of Normandy, was on crusade at the time, conveniently thousands of miles away and unable to contest the succession. By the time Robert returned, Henry had consolidated power completely. Walter Tyrrell was never brought back to face questioning. Henry showed no interest in investigating the death. The church, which had despised William Rufus, showed no interest either. Everyone seemed content to move on. Hunting accident. Nothing to see here. But that's ancient history. Surely by the late medieval period, the monarchy had developed more sophisticated methods for handling inconvenient relatives. Oh, they had. And sometimes they got creative. Let's talk about George, Duke of Clarence. George was the middle brother of 3 York princes in the 15th century. His older brother was King Edward IV. His younger brother was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The future Richard III. George was, by all accounts, a problem. He'd switched sides during the Wars of the Roses. Twice. He'd plotted against his own brother, the king. He'd been forgiven, plotted again, been forgiven again, and then kept plotting. By 1478, Edward IV had finally had enough. George was arrested, charged with treason, and sentenced to death. Here's where it gets strange. On February 18, 1478, George, Duke of Clarence, was executed in the Tower of London. But not by the usual methods, not beheading, not hanging. According to contemporary accounts and later chronicles, George was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. A butt was a barrel, about 475 liters. And Malmsey was a sweet wine imported from the Mediterranean. Was he actually drowned in wine? Nobody knows for certain. Some historians suggest it's a dark joke that became accepted as fact. Others note that George may have been given the choice of execution method and chose something befitting his reputation for excessive drinking. The Burgundian chronicler, Jean de Wavrin, recorded the story as fact. When George's daughter Margaret Pole was executed in 1541, she wore a miniature wine barrel on her wrist in memory of her father's death. What everyone agrees on is this: George was killed in the Tower. His brother the king ordered it, and within 5 years both Edward IV and his 2 young sons would be dead, leaving Richard, the youngest brother, as King Richard III. The princes in the Tower. We'll get to them. But first, notice the pattern. 3 brothers. One becomes king. The middle one dies under bizarre circumstances. The youngest eventually takes the throne. Funny how that works out. Now let's talk about those princes. In April 1483, King Edward IV died unexpectedly at 40 years old. He left behind 2 sons, Edward, who was 12, and Richard, who was 9. The elder boy automatically became King Edward V, but he was a child, so his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector to govern until the boy came of age. Richard intercepted the young king before he could reach London and had him lodged in the Tower of London. This wasn't necessarily sinister at the time. The Tower was a royal residence, and kings traditionally stayed there before their coronations. Within weeks, the younger prince was brought to join his brother, keeping them together for their safety. The coronation was scheduled for June 22, 1483. It never happened. Instead, a clergyman named Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at St. Paul's Cross on June 22, declaring that Edward IV's marriage had been invalid, making both princes illegitimate and ineligible for the throne. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was therefore the rightful king. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned Richard III. The princes were last seen playing in the Tower grounds in the summer of 1483. Then they vanished. No announcement, no funeral, no explanation. 2 boys, 12 and 9 years old, simply ceased to exist. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was forced into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Their supporters were arrested or fled, and the new king said nothing about what had happened to his nephews. For 2 years, Richard III ruled. Rumors circulated about the prince's fate, but no bodies were produced, no confession was obtained, no public explanation was offered. In 1485, Henry Tudor invaded England, defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and became Henry VII. Henry also said nothing about the princes. He married their sister, Elizabeth of York, which was a clever move. If the princes had been legitimate, his wife would have a stronger claim to the throne than he did. If they were illegitimate, as Richard had claimed, she had no claim at all. By keeping the question ambiguous, Henry made his wife's bloodline an asset without creating complications. The boys disappeared. In 1674, nearly 200 years later, workmen demolishing a staircase in the Tower of London discovered a wooden box buried beneath the foundations. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. Charles II ordered the bones to be placed in an urn designed by Christopher Wren and interred in Westminster Abbey as the remains of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. Were they? We don't know for certain. The bones have never been subjected to modern DNA testing, despite repeated requests from historians. The Church of England has refused to allow the urn to be opened, so we're left with this. 2 children entered the Tower of London in 1483 and were never seen again. Their uncle became king. Bones matching their approximate ages were found in the Tower 2 centuries later, and nobody has ever been officially held responsible. Some historians argue Richard III ordered the murders. Others suggest Henry VII eliminated them after his victory to remove rival claimants. A few propose they died of natural causes. Disease was common in medieval England, and Richard simply kept quiet to avoid accusations. What everyone agrees on is that two princes disappeared, and someone benefited enormously from their absence. Hunting accident, wine barrel accident, tower accident. Same principle, really. And this pattern doesn't stop in the medieval period. The British monarchy has experienced a remarkable number of convenient deaths throughout its history. From the execution of Charles I in 1649 to various heirs who died young under circumstances that historians still debate. When brothers stood between someone and power, those brothers had a way of not standing there anymore. But let's return to the 20th century, because the 1936 abdication didn't just remove Edward from the throne. It transformed a 10-year-old princess into the heir presumptive. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was a child when her uncle's abdication made her father King George VI. She watched her father, a man who never expected to rule, who suffered from a severe stammer, assume a burden that arguably shortened his life. George VI died on February 6, 1952, at 56 years old, having reigned through World War II and its aftermath. Elizabeth became queen at 25. The abdication shaped everything about how she understood her role: duty above personal happiness, institution above individual. Never complain, never explain. This philosophy got tested almost immediately. In the early 1950s, Princess Margaret fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a Royal Air Force officer who served as an equerry to the king. Townsend was divorced. His wife had left him for another man, making him technically the innocent party. But that distinction meant nothing under Church of England doctrine. Margaret required the sovereign's consent to marry before age 25. Elizabeth's advisors made clear that consent would not be forthcoming. The similarities to Edward's situation were obvious. Another royal in love with a divorced person. Another impossible choice between heart and crown. But Margaret wasn't king. She didn't have the option of abdicating from duties she'd been raised to fulfill. And Elizabeth, having witnessed what her uncle's choice had done to her father, was not about to let history repeat itself. If Margaret waited until she turned 25, she could notify Parliament of her intention to marry and proceed unless both houses objected within 12 months. But doing so would likely require her to renounce her royal income, her place in the succession, and potentially her right to reside in Britain. The establishment made clear that choosing Townsend meant losing everything else. On October 31, 1955, Margaret issued a statement announcing she had decided not to marry Townsend, citing her duty to the Commonwealth and the Church. The rules that removed Edward VIII from the throne were applied, with equal force, to prevent Margaret from marrying the man she loved. No hunting accidents required. The institution had learned to use paperwork instead. So where does that leave us with Harry and Meghan? Well, something happened between 1955 and 2018. Actually, several things happened, and the most important one occurred on August 31, 1997. Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a Paris car crash. Her funeral on September 6, 1997, drew an estimated 2.5 billion television viewers worldwide. Approximately 1 million mourners lined the streets of London. But the crisis wasn't the death itself. It was the royal family's response. When Diana died, Elizabeth II and the family were at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, following their summer schedule. The Queen's initial decision was to stay in Scotland to shield William and Harry from the media circus descending on London. No flag flew at half-staff over Buckingham Palace, because protocol said the only flag flown there was the royal standard, which flew only when the sovereign was in residence. This adherence to protocol, the same dignified reserve that had worked for 45 years, proved catastrophic. British tabloids demanded to know where the Queen was. Why hadn't she spoken? Crowds leaving flowers at Kensington Palace grew openly hostile toward the perceived coldness of the royal family. Approval ratings dropped to historically low levels. The monarchy suddenly looked like it might not survive its own rigidity. Prime Minister Tony Blair reportedly intervened directly, urging the Queen to return to London. On September 5, 1997, Elizabeth delivered a televised address speaking as your Queen and as a grandmother. The unprecedented lowering of the Union flag over Buckingham Palace was ordered. The immediate crisis passed, but the lesson was absorbed. The monarchy survived on public affection. That affection required active cultivation. The traditional posture of dignified silence was no longer enough. What followed was 2 decades of institutional rehabilitation. William and Harry were positioned as the relatable, accessible face of the monarchy. Young men who'd endured public tragedy. William's marriage to Catherine Middleton on April 29, 2011, was broadcast to an estimated 2 billion viewers and represented a triumph of royal pageantry. Catherine's background, middle class by royal standards, her parents having built a party supplies business, demonstrated that commoners could be welcomed. Charles and Camilla underwent their own rehabilitation. They finally married on April 9, 2005, in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall. The Queen attended neither the ceremony nor the subsequent religious blessing. She appeared at the reception afterward. Her toast reportedly compared the couple to a horse that had won the Grand National against the odds. The Church of England's General Synod had voted in 2002 to permit divorced persons to remarry in church under certain circumstances. Progress. Sort of. And then came Harry and Meghan. Meghan Markle was an American actress known for the legal drama Suits, with a social media following of approximately 1.9 million on Instagram. She was divorced, having married producer Trevor Engelson on September 10, 2011, in Jamaica. The marriage ended in divorce in August 2013. Under the criteria that governed royal marriages in 1936, 1955, and even 2005, her divorced status should have presented a significant obstacle. Harry was 5th in line to the throne, behind Charles, William, and William's 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis. Not a distant position. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, Harry required the sovereign's permission to marry. Queen Elizabeth II granted permission, with the formal Instrument of Consent issued in March 2018. Before the wedding, Meghan was invited to spend Christmas 2017 with the royal family at Sandringham, an invitation typically extended only to spouses, not fiancés. The contrast was extraordinary. Edward VIII had been forced to choose between his wife and his crown. Margaret had been prevented from marrying Peter Townsend entirely. Charles and Camilla had waited years for permission and received only partial royal attendance at their wedding. Harry and Meghan received enthusiastic institutional endorsement within months of their public engagement. The wedding took place on May 19, 2018, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, presided. American Episcopal Bishop Michael Curry delivered a sermon referencing the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King Jr. A gospel choir performed "Stand By Me." Meghan walked herself partway down the aisle before Prince Charles escorted her the remainder of the distance. The monarchy in 2018 faced challenges that didn't exist in 1936. Declining engagement among younger generations, questions about the cost of maintaining the royal household, approximately £67 million annually from public funds, an uncertain succession with a 70-year-old heir apparent following a 91-year-old queen. Meghan Markle offered solutions. Her celebrity brought global media attention. Her biracial heritage allowed the monarchy to present itself as capable of evolution and inclusion. Her American following expanded the royal brand's reach. The rules hadn't really changed. The Church of England's 2002 modification provided legal cover, but the warmth of the institutional embrace? That had nothing to do with doctrine and everything to do with desperation. A monarchy that had nearly collapsed from its own coldness in 1997 couldn't afford to reject a popular, photogenic celebrity bride over the same divorce rules they'd weaponized against Edward VIII. So they didn't. And somewhere, perhaps, Edward's ghost looked at Harry's wedding and thought, "Am I a joke to you?" Of course, Edward also posed for photographs with Adolf Hitler and allegedly suggested that bombing Britain could help the Nazi cause. So maybe the comparison isn't entirely fair. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. After all the scandals, all the abdications, all the brothers who conveniently disappeared across the centuries, drowned in wine barrels, killed by convenient arrows, vanished into the tower, these people are still there, sitting in their palaces, wearing their crowns, tracing their lineage back further than almost any other family on Earth. The current British royals can document their ancestry back to Egbert of Wessex in the 800s. Over 1,000 years. Unbroken. Think about that for a moment. Most of us can barely name our great-great-grandparents. These people know exactly who their family was when the Vikings were raiding English shores. They know which ancestor fought at Hastings, which one signed the Magna Carta, which one lost his head on Tower Green, which one drowned his brother in a barrel of sweet wine. That's not nothing. The rules are performative. The scandals are endless. The whole institution is patently absurd if you think about it for more than 5 minutes. Princes vanished in the tower. Kings died in suspicious hunting accidents. A duke drowned in wine. An uncle abdicated because of Nazi sympathies, dressed up as a love story. And somehow, through all of it, the crown passed from head to head, generation after generation, for a millennium. And yet, imagine knowing your family tree stretches back 1,000 years. Imagine the weight of that. Every decision made in the shadow of ancestors whose names still appear in history books. Every marriage, every child, every choice scrutinized not just by the public, but by the accumulated expectations of 40 generations. The monarchy is ridiculous. It's also remarkable. Both things can be true. Edward gave up everything for love, or he was pushed out because he was a security risk, or both. Harry married who he wanted and faced no consequences, or he was welcomed because the institution desperately needed what he offered, or both. The rules bend. They always have. What matters is which way the wind is blowing when you need them to bend. And if the wind isn't blowing your way, well, history suggests there's always the possibility of a hunting accident. Subscribe for more stories like this.